With it currently being National Free Speech Week, is the Tully Center doing anything specific to recognize this event?
The Tully Center is annually a partner in Free Speech Week, along with dozens of other institutes and organizations. And we're just trying to promote the issue. In the past, we've had tables in some buildings on campus, primarily Newhouse. This year, we're just using our social media because we've got some events coming up, so we couldn't really dedicate a lot of extra time. But in my world, every week is Free Speech Week.
Right. College campuses have been featured often in the media lately for discouraging free speech from positions that are considered right-leaning or more traditional. Do you believe this type of speech is being restricted at Syracuse, or just any speech in general being too restricted on campus?
I think Syracuse does a pretty good job of having diverse speakers. The university has a pretty good commitment to diversity of viewpoints. I've never personally been discouraged from having a controversial speaker or speaking out on controversial topics. So I think we're in pretty good hands right now. College campuses in general are a pretty precarious place right now. People with conservative viewpoints, politically conservative viewpoints, tend to be discouraged on many college campuses. We saw that at Berkeley. We've seen that in some other places. So it is kind of a scary place if you're not part of if you're on the right of the political spectrum. So.
What do you think people like Abby Hoffman and other free speech activists from the 60s would have to say about the state of campuses today if they were alive?
That's a real interesting question. I think some of the absolutists from the 60s would encourage a diversity of speakers. But and when you go back and look in history, how the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, it was people on the far political left or the political left who were being censored or punished for their speech. And today it's the complete opposite, partially because many of the people who had the left-leaning political viewpoints in the 60s are now at top leadership positions on college campuses. So it's interesting to see that dynamic and how that dynamic has shifted. I think some of the free speech purists out there, some of the people maybe even with libertarian viewpoints, would encourage anybody to speak as long as they're not causing a riot or burning places down. But I mean, that would be an interesting question, to go into a time warp and bring people who were censored, suppressed, and punished in the 60s onto a college campus to hear people with the complete opposite viewpoint of them.
Right. You mentioned before that you believe Free Speech Week should be every week. What is the Tully Center doing specifically on campus to promote freedom of intellectual thought and speech?
Well, part of our mission at the center is to educate the public and students to free speech and free press issues. And how we do that varies. We bring in speakers, I do a lot of speaking and some advocacy, maybe even some low-level advocacy with things that I write and things that I sign on for advocacy letters. But the biggest thing we do is bring guests to campus who talk about these issues. Next week, I'm co-hosting an event with the iSchool with Lee Rainey. He is the Director of Research for Internet and Technology at the Pew Research Center. And we're going to talk about internet policy and internet speech and many of the issues that are really on the cutting edge of modern free speech issues.
Right. Being established in the Newhouse School, and as you mentioned, the Tully Center for Free Speech recognizes freedom of the press. So what do you feel about Megyn Kelly's recent demise over a remark where she asked what was wrong with wearing blackface on Halloween?
Well, Megyn Kelly said some things that hurt a lot of people, that inflamed a lot of people, things that are pretty ignorant, demeaning the history of blackface and racism and racist depictions. That being said, is that something that she should be fired for or punished for? I see this as a teaching moment. And I think that's what free speech does. It allows us to take some offensive things or even ignorant statements and learn about them. Maybe Megyn Kelly didn't understand the history of what blackface is all about. And to grant her the benefit of the doubt, we'll grant her ignorance and teach her about it. Or on the other hand, maybe this was a calculated statement intended to for some ulterior motive. We don't know. It'll take time to figure out what's going on. But at the end of the day, the question is, should she be fired for saying something that was ignorant? And people say stupid things all the time. I don't know if that should, warrant termination. Education, definitely. Termination, maybe not. But I'm not an NBC executive.
Going off of that, do you believe in the concept of hate speech? And if so, where do you personally draw the line between free speech and hate speech? Well,
one of the difficult elements of our multicultural democracy is that we have a lot of people with a lot of different viewpoints and people with a lot of different backgrounds and religions and ethnicities, and we have to figure a way to coexist and deal with offensive material. Hate speech is not illegal in the United States. And in some countries there are laws that prohibit demeaning ethnic groups or religious minorities. In other countries, it's a free-for-all. In the U.S., it's sort of a free-for-all with things that you can say. That being said, just because you can say outrageous, hurtful, offensive things doesn't necessarily mean that you should. So, we've got a delicate balance here. As far as I'm concerned, I'm pretty close to an absolutist on reining in or punishing speakers, even if it means dealing with content that I personally find offensive. I find things offensive too. Does that mean that I believe that somebody saying that should be censored? And the answer to that is no. As long as you're not causing actual physical violence or inciting an actual riot or violence, I'm pretty close to an absolutist, even on things that I find personally offensive.
Do you believe outside of college campuses and throughout the media, throughout Hollywood, is there a new pop culture that is impeding free speech, and how does our society grapple with that? How does the Tully Center specifically grapple with that?
Well, the Tully Center supports free speech in every environment. That being said, there are forces, there are market forces, private forces that do punish certain types of speakers. Just because you can say something outrageous doesn't mean that there won't be repercussions in a private setting. We just saw it with Megyn Kelly. She got fired. We've seen it with, some, behavior that was inappropriate with, some comedians and some broadcasters, but that's not necessarily a speech issue. But we see how private companies, businesses, can restrain their employees. So, there are repercussions for saying things that are hateful or offensive, and that takes it outside of the scope of the government. It's not the government that's censoring people, it's the marketplace. And if somebody who's in the public eye, an entertainer, a comedian, an athlete, if somebody says something outrageous that offends a lot of people, well, there might be backlash. There might be protests, there might be boycotts, there might be firings or terminations. So, and that's always been the case.
Right. Thank you so much for visiting us today.
My pleasure.